First, thank you. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to Trustee Huckster Mercantile. I'm Patrick, and appreciate you joining the chat tonight. It is a live chat and a little bit different. For those of you who may be familiar with my channel, I've historically talked about definitely some history, but usually tied to antiques, decorative arts, vintage. That we do some selling here and there. It's a new year. It's a new, we'll just say it's a new time. And I decided to make a couple changes to the channel and introducing the Gay History Book Club. And so tonight is the very first discussion, the very first selection. And tonight, hopefully that's why you're here, we are discussing Bent by Martin Sherman. Now, we're being pretty flexible in the Gay History Book Club for those who did read it or don't, or at least know a little bit about it. There's a lot of gay history in it, but it's fiction. It's a fictionalized version. So we may put air quotes around the gay history for tonight, but don't let that fool you, because tonight we've got a guest, a couple of guests, actually. One, we've got Dr. Rajiv Vaidyanathan, who's joining me. And we are going to be hosting tonight and discussing both the script as well as the movie of Bent. But we also have joining us Dr. Jake Newsome. So I'll give you a quick little biography of Jake. Dr. Jake Newsome is an award-winning scholar of German and American LGBTQ+ history whose research and resources educate global audiences. He's the founder and director of the Pink Triangle Legacies Project, a grassroots initiative that honors the memory of the Nazi queer victims and carries on their legacy by fighting homophobia and transphobia through education, empowerment, and advocacy. He's also the author of Pink Triangle Legacies, Coming Out in the Shadow of the Holocaust, which, had I known about that, I might have included that as part of our book club. So you never know. But thank you so much for joining us, Jake.
Yeah, thank you, Patrick and Raj. It's really great to be here to discuss this really important piece of gay history. I mean, as you said, it tells gay history, but Bent itself is also like a really pivotal piece of gay history in and of itself. So I'm really excited to dive in.
And can you give a little background? What is your history with Bent and with author Martin Sherman?
Yeah, so you know, as you mentioned, my book is it's a history of the Pink Triangle from its origins as a concentration camp badge for gay prisoners in the Nazi camps, all the way through its transformation and reclamation as an LGBTQ rights symbol. And then really even up through the present day. And so in that research for the book, I came across the stage play Bent, which, as you mentioned, was later turned into a movie, because it was if I'm not mistaken, 1979, like was one of the very first productions or books or anything really to broach this history and to tell this history, and so it really plays a pivotal role or spot in my own book, and just by chance in the modern world that we live in of social media, I happened to get in connected and in contact with Martin Sherman on Facebook, and introduced myself and found out actually that he had read my book Pink Triangle Legacies, and thought that it was a really important contribution to the history. And so I told my own husband that, like, okay, I'm done now, like I can retire. I've got Martin Sherman's thumbs up. So
that is absolutely fantastic. And so I give it a little bit of background as before we get into the actual discussion. With my history with Bent, I had started, for those who follow my channel know my personal story, I started very late in life coming out. And so I really started exploring the gay history and gay world very much later in life. And I started discovering the whole concept. And one of the things that Bent covers is this idea of persecution of the homosexuals during World War II. And this is just definitely not something that was covered in my high school history class, small rural town in Illinois. And it's one of those cases that, though even in my adulthood, it's not something I came across really at all. So when I stumbled across it, started like doing some deep dives into the history, stumbled across Bent. Again, people that know my background, I do a little bit of community theater. I am actually just recently submitted my director's application to direct bent at a local theater. Hopefully it'll get accepted. So I really studied it, really fascinated by this history, as dark as it is, because it's just something that I don't want to see get lost. So for those of you who've read the book or watched the movie, I really encourage you. There is a live chat. So as you are watching this, whether it's on YouTube or for the chat mode, you need to look at either live chat or top chat. You can also do it on a mobile device. We are open to questions as we go through the evening, but we are going to go ahead and talk about the details of the book. So if you've not read the book or seen the movie, sorry, not sorry. Spoiler alerts are going to be all over the place. So we'll just put a blanket one at the top. Spoiler alert, the next 30 minutes, we're going to be telling you what's happening in this. But we are going to start with how the book itself starts out. So I've got some notes. As you said, it was written in 1979. And if you hadn't read it yet, for people that had not read it, it is a script. So this is not something that we will only be doing in the future. We'll be doing traditional books. This just happens to be a script because of the connection. And it was written in 1979. I do believe, although I don't know this for sure, Martin Sherman is British, isn't he? Or is he American?
I think, if I'm not mistaken, he was American, but living in England at the time.
Okay, because it did open on the West End in London first. Yes. So it opened in 1979, went on to the Olivier Awards. The main character, Max, was played by Ian McKellen, and Ian McKellen did win the Laurence Olivier Award in 1979 for Best Actor in a Play. Later in 1979, it opened on Broadway, and there Richard Gere played Max, the key character. And a side little weird note for those of you of a certain age who know Family Ties, Michael Gross, the father of Family Ties, he played Greta in the original Broadway production. There were some Tony nominations for it. Unfortunately, it did not win the Tony. It lost to Children of a Lesser God. And David Dukes, who played Horst, lost to David Rounds from Mornings at 7. So it did have a couple of Tony noms. Unfortunately, it didn't win anything. But then probably what most people are familiar with is the movie version. So that was 1997, and that starred Clive Owen as Max, the main character. Interestingly, Ian McKellen, who had originated the role on the West End, he came back to do the movie, and there he played Uncle Freddie, and playing Greta was Mick Jagger. So definitely something to trying to draw people in. Now, I will admit I was not familiar with this film. I was 27 years old in 1997. I do not remember this coming out. I do not remember a lot of promotional marketing campaign, but it was 1997. So I'm not overly surprised about that. So it starts the morning after a party. We meet Max, his roommate and partner, Rudy, and a gentleman who we find out is Wolf. And it comes apparent during the script that it's after kind of a night of debauchery at a predominantly gay club. It's much clearly more spelled out in the movie than it is in the script, but there's enough lines that it's pretty clear that the night before they had a really good time with a lot of men at a Berlin bar. It turns out to be Greta's club. So one of the first questions I wanted to ask you, Jake, because I know you've done a lot of research on this for your book. Can you just talk about, as it turns out, it opens in 1934. What was gay life like in Berlin in 1934?
Gay life in Germany in the 20th century, in the 1900s, we think about kind of this conservative, violent regime of the Nazis, but really before the Nazis came to power, stretching from about 1918, after Germany lost World War I, a democracy was established. It was called the Weimar Republic because its constitution was established in this town called Weimar. And as I said, it was Germany's first democracy, and so minorities, including sexual and gender minorities, gained much more political and civil rights than they had previously. And so in the 15 years or so leading up to the Nazi takeover of power, Germany, but especially Berlin, was kind of a gay mecca. Folks came from New York and Berlin and Paris. New York and London and Paris to Berlin, rather, to experience this level of, like, it certainly wasn't full acceptance, but a level of tolerance that just didn't exist anywhere else in the world. And so, again, this is mainly in Germany's larger urban centers like Berlin, Frankfurt, Hamburg, where really LGBTQ folks, kind of all stripes, were carving out uh, more and more public spaces for themselves, not just kind of hidden underground. And so in Berlin alone, for example, there were over 100 different bars, clubs, cafes, and businesses that catered to LGBTQ clientele. There was a incredibly vibrant LGBTQ press organizations. I mean, whether you wanted or were interested in sports or politics or art, you could find a queer magazine for you, or a newspaper, or a monthly newsletter. And so it really was this place um, of acceptance where, again, just wanted to emphasize that it's not just kind of queer subcultures, but we're very, the public was aware of LGBTQ folks, and their communities. I will, I guess, kind of add a big comma there, right? That at the same time that Germans are experiencing this kind of growth of LGBTQ communities, there exist numerous laws in Germany that are called laws that criminalize crimes against morality. And so, for example, the most famous of those was called Paragraph 175, and this was the national law that criminalized, in its wording, unnatural indecency between men. So this was essentially the national anti-sodomy law that was used against men. That had existed since Germany was united in 1871. Even during this democratic period, it stayed on the books. What changed was that in some of the places like Berlin, local law enforcement decided that essentially unnatural indecency was a victimless crime, and so they stopped enforcing it as often as before. But really, throughout the rest of Germany, in the smaller kind of rural places, Germans were actually ramping up their enforcement of laws like Paragraph 171. They saw homosexuality, queerness, as a social disease almost, that was originating in the big cities like Berlin, and they wanted to keep it from spreading to the countryside, essentially.
And so that's where it gets us in the timeline then of the script. So as it turns out, and some of this is not 100% clearly spelled out, so you have to kind of piece together some dots, but it does determine that this play opens the morning after what is turns out to be the Night of Long Knives. Mm-hmm. So at the end of Act 1, or end of Scene 1, Wolf, again, spoiler alert, Wolf is murdered. And as Max and Rudy flee their apartment, they run and they find Greta, who hosted the club or owned the club that they had been at the night before. And through Scene 2, there's a little bit of explanation and exposition that goes on to kind of fill in the dots of what exactly is going on. And so, although the term Night of Long Knives is never actually discussed, that's something that I know Raj and I have talked about. I think you talked a little bit about your book. The idea behind that was Hitler had come to power in January of 1933. We are now in the summer of 1934. And there was a little bit of kind of a combination, just like you said, things were starting to change. Paragraph 175 was maybe being looked at as being too loose. There's also a question that the head of the SA, the stormtroopers, was a known homosexual, and he was trying to gather up more power. And so the Night of Long Knives, Ernst Röhm, was assassinated. Mm-hmm. Now, Greta never actually, I don't know if Greta actually uses that name. It might be in the script, but where they describe is Wolf was the boyfriend of Karl Ernst, who was second in command to Van Heldorf, who was second in command to Ernst Röhm, who was the head of the SA. So it's kind of a little connect the dots. That's why Wolf was murdered, and that's why they are now on the run. Mm-hmm. So timing-wise, we're 1934. Max and Rudy do run off. They end up meeting their Uncle Freddie in the movie, played by Ian McKellen. And in that scene, it's discussed that they've been on the run for 2 years. Mm-hmm. So we've jumped into 1936, and there's a little phrase or a little line that Uncle Freddie references, says they've passed a law, we're not allowed to be fluffs anymore, the term he was using for homosexuals, and they can arrest you for having fluff thoughts. So that pushes us in 1936. So Jake, can you talk a little bit about what happened to paragraph 175 in 1935?
Yeah, absolutely. So, as you mentioned, I mean, the timeline is really important. Hitler comes to power January of 1933. The Nazis become the largest party in parliament, and they have made their stance on homosexuality incredibly clear. And they from essentially within a matter of 2 to 3 weeks, they begin their crackdown on trying to close all of these LGBTQ pubs and clubs and bars and organizations that had emerged over the previous 15 years. What they discover really over the course of those 2 years, getting us up to 1935, is that even though they have inherited this national anti-gay law, the way that it is worded, they think puts way too many legal constraints on how they can apply it. Because the way that the German court system had interpreted it and essentially set the precedent was that in order to grant a conviction for unnatural indecency, the court had to prove what they called intercourse-like acts. And so this was oftentimes it could be thrown out. If it was between two consenting adults, they could simply say like, "Hey, no, that never happened." And so a lot, the number of while the number of arrests kind of remained high, the number of convictions was relatively low. So of course the Nazi leadership decided this is during a process where they're also writing the Nuremberg race laws, which is defining German citizenship along racial boundaries, right? That if you're non-Aryan, so to speak, that you could not have citizenship anymore. At the same time that they're writing these laws, they're trying to bring other laws into an alignment with Nazi ideals. And so they decide to rewrite paragraph 175. And the new law simply states that a man who commits indecency with another man or who allows himself to be misused indecently is now that's now punishable with prison, a sentence up to 10 years. And so, right, the idea that as I was studying this, it kind of made me think like, how do you legally define indecency? And it turns out like that was actually really just the point, was to leave that term as broad and vague as possible, so that they could, prosecutors and judges could interpret that how they wanted to on a case by case basis, with the really explicit intention of being able to convict as many men as possible. And so what Uncle Freddie says there is that we can be arrested for even having fluff thoughts. We actually have a quote from a lawyer who went on to be the minister of justice in Nazi Germany, which, what an oxymoron, right? To have a ministry of justice, but who ultimately said that it's not necessary for a physical action to take place to grant a conviction. It's only necessary if uh, uh, um, it's only necessary if unnatural thoughts had taken place. So again, we actually that is from a direct quote from Nazi leadership, that they are now trying to root out not just actions but even kind of the core of the desires themselves.
And you had mentioned that prior to them rewriting the law in 35, it was harder to get the convictions. I didn't introduce as part of your introduction, I didn't mention that the way I found you was through a wonderful presentation you did with Queensborough Community College. And you mentioned a couple things during that, one of them being kind of an extension of that concept. You mentioned, I want to say it was something like a third of the convictions that they ended up getting after they were rewritten. Can you talk about that? I think you know what I was going to lead into.
Yeah, so one of the things that I've just found the most shocking in my research, and honestly, living through today, maybe it's not as shocking anymore, but is just how wildly popular the Nazis' homophobic and transphobic policies were. I mean, these were policies that really ordinary Germans seemed to not just ignore or comply with, but actively support in staggering numbers. And so, for example, you mentioned this, the statistic 1/3 out of all of the paragraph 175 convictions between the years 1933 and 1945, about a third of those were the result of civilian denunciations, right? So these were, gay people's, landlords or their neighbors or their bosses, in some cases even their own family members, turning them into the Nazi regime. And in fact, in one instance, if I believe it, I think I'm right, it was in Hamburg in 1936. The number of the number of denunciations grew so dramatically that the police actually ran an article in the Hamburg newspaper asking ordinary citizens to quit turning in so many gay people to their office, because essentially they needed a chance to like catch up on all these tips that they had been getting. But of course, that they also said, thank you for being good loyal citizens and helping us reach our goal, but you've got to help us catch up with everyone that you've turned in.
And there was no incentive to do so, right? Other than the idea of being a good German citizen. Okay. So
Absolutely.
it wasn't like they were being paid or something for doing that.
Right.
Yeah, that's troubling. But yes, maybe as you said, with what we've been living through, maybe it's not quite as big of a stretch for us to consider that. Did you have a question for Jake?
A question and a comment, Jake. I mean, we've seen in the last 10 years very obvious and popular anti-gay laws in Russia, where there is violence against gay and trans youth and imprisonment, often on the basis of public indecency or immorality. So it is, as you say, not that much of a stretch. Could you comment? I mean, is that something de novo in Russia, or does it have its roots in that kind of legislation that allows scapegoating?
I think you really hit the nail on the head. Is that a lot of times, if you study these extreme examples, of where homophobia, transphobia has been codified into law, whether it's Nazi Germany, Russia, or in even some of the anti-LGBTQ legislation that has been at least proposed or even passed here in the United States, is you start to see trends. And what, for example, a similarity between the rhetoric that the Nazis used and what we're seeing in Russia is that the laws themselves and even the rhetoric that the leadership uses doesn't necessarily attack individuals or identities, right? Because especially today, after the Holocaust, the idea of attacking someone for their identity, is rightfully recognized as a violation of a human right. And so the rhetoric then, that folks like in Russia use is that we're not criminalizing gay people. We're not making it illegal to be gay. But what we're doing is we're passing laws to protect youth from, the gay agenda, right? Of being sexualized, of essentially grooming. And so if you listen to the words they use, it's always this kind of broad noun. It's actually not the criminalization of individual people. It's the same thing in the United States with the rhetoric of, we are trying to protect America's children from being groomed. It's, but we see when the laws are implemented and put in place, of course they do target and attack individual people or communities. The same thing, I mean, the Nazis from the 1920s when they were campaigning, but then especially once they got into power, their rhetoric and their campaign propaganda was that, almost sounds word from word what we're hearing today, is that they were trying to protect German youth, especially German young boys, because the homosexuals were trying to recruit young people into the homosexual lifestyle, right? So it's all of their laws that they passed.
Kind of the justification.
That was the justification, and so we actually see that again and again throughout the decades, and I think that's important for us to note in order to be able to more effectively confront it.
And we have some great comments coming in from the chat as well, and we're going to be circling back to some of these. But circling back to your comment about the denunciations, bringing us back into the book, into the script, which is also represented in the movie. So now we're at the end of scene 4. Rudy and Max have been on the run, and it is discovered that Rudy has been having a conversation with an individual he thinks is going to be able to help them. And Max, as it turns out, correctly recognizes, you shouldn't have told anyone that we were here. And that denunciation occurs, and they are captured while they're in the woods, and they are taken onto a train, which, as we later determine, is headed toward Dachau. Now, on that train, they meet the third major character of the book, who is Horst. Now, Horst, we're not going to get into the details of what happens on the train. I don't even want to spoil that one. We don't need to talk about that. We'll just say it's not a good thing. But what ends up happening, some very important exposition that Max hears from this new character, Horst, talking about how life will be in the camps. And one of the things that Horst starts talking about is the Pink Triangle. So, of course, we've got the titular name of your book, the project. As you said, it's been reclaimed. There's references to the Pink Triangle. And he talks about how those triangles and any markings are used in the camp. And I think most people, even I, in my very conservative and small backwards community, learned about the Jewish Star of David, marking the Jewish prisoners. But I wasn't as familiar with these triangles. So can you talk a little bit, as somewhat outlined in the book, but can you talk a little bit about how what other marks were available?
Yeah, so in the concentration camp system, all incoming prisoners were marked with one of these color-coded triangle badges that was sewn onto their uniforms, and it was a way for, on the one hand, the SS officials to be able to keep track of a prisoner's so-called crime, but it was also a visual marker, essentially a divide and conquer strategy, because they wanted to, number one, continue to dehumanize the concentration camp prisoners by reducing them down to their so-called crime, right? They wanted essentially that to be the very first thing that other prisoners noticed about you, was what color triangle you had. And again, it was a way to help ensure that bonds of solidarity wouldn't form amongst the concentration camp inmates. And so
Interesting.
There is you can find online the Nazis actually had these charts that showed which what each of the different colors stood for. And so absolutely, you mentioned the yellow star was used for Jewish prisoners, but a red triangle was for political prisoners. Purple triangles were for Jehovah's Witnesses. Green triangles were for what the Nazis called common criminals. So this might have been folks who were arrested for larceny or kind of any other quote unquote normal law. But we also had the pink triangle, which was explicitly for folks who were arrested under paragraph 175. So for mostly gay men. And then there was the brown triangle was for Roma and Sinti, and then the black triangle was what the Nazis called asocials, or kind of anti-social people. That was kind of a miscellaneous category that if you didn't already fit one of the other triangles, you might have been labeled with a black triangle. So it was used for lesbians and transgender people. It was used for unhoused people, people struggling with alcoholism, sex workers, kind of a broad range of people whom the Nazis considered to be socially degenerate.
Now, you had mentioned, it's referenced in the script that Pink Triangle were the lowest of the low, but also in your presentation on the Queensborough College presentation, you also talked about how people that got the Pink Triangle were effectively given they were treated the worst, they were given the worst jobs, and also the least amount of food. Was that a written practice, or is that, as you said, just a way, it's kind of what happened, the prisoners amongst themselves?
I think so. It was never, at least what I have not found it anywhere in my research, that it was not kind of an official policy, but it was kind of a natural manifestation of homophobia right, that permeated not just outside society, but also within the concentration camps themselves. And so, prisoners with the Pink Triangle had to face that homophobia from the SS guards, of course, but also from their fellow prisoners. And so, we do know kind of from the top down, the SS assigned them those harder work details, less food. But then also they, from the fellow prisoners themselves, like they were often kind of kept out of the loop of kind of the black markets that might emerge in the camps, where you could trade, something for an extra piece of bread, or something that might actually save your life. Gay prisoners were pretty much excluded from those types of exchanges. And so we do know that the gay prisoners, or those with the Pink Triangle, had the highest death rate in the concentration camps, except for those like Jews and Roma and Sinti that were, slated for mass murder and extermination.
Now, you mentioned about the bribery of the systems that were there among some of the other prisoners, and that actually does come into play in the script as well. Because, again, for those who haven't read it, even though Max is a homosexual, he negotiates, pretty much sets himself up as a con man throughout the whole show, or the whole script, that he effectively, through a couple of actions, is able to get himself a Star of David as opposed to the Pink Triangle. And he then explains that he was able to receive money that was sent to him by his uncle. And it was one line that was just thrown in there, and it's the way he gets the money to get Horst transferred to his workload.
Mm-hmm.
And he got money. That it's just, and there's just other things that I've seen in the past, maybe about Jewish prisoners. People could send them packages, birthday gifts, things like that. That in some cases it was just protective custody. That there was nothing wrong. It was just like being in prison, and you could have it. So even since he got himself away from being a Pink Triangle, he was able to take advantage of doing that. We're going to jump, and I need to be sensitive to your time. I realize that you were not going to be able to stay for the whole period. So at any point, if you need to sign off,
I do need to sign off. But I thank you for having me. And I hope everyone who's watching continues to have a great conversation led by y'all. And again, I appreciate the invitation to join you so much.
No, I appreciate your time. And I recognize, yes, you've got other things you need to do. We appreciate the half hour you could give us, and we will continue. So as you sign off, we're going to wrap up with a couple other things. And I've got some quotes from you that I will just read. So thanks a lot, Dr. Jake Newsome. And we'll put some notes in the description of how to find Jake Newsome and his book, Pink Triangle Legacies Project.
Perfect. I appreciate it. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thanks, Jake. Bye-bye. So as we unfortunately have to say goodbye to Jake, we are going to finish with the way the book plays itself out. So the script, again, we're not going to get into the details of how it ends, because this is a fictionalization. Unfortunately, it is a realistic depiction of what would be happening. But in April 29th, 1945, Dachau is liberated at the end of World War II. If you watch the movie version, it was not filmed in Dachau, nor even a version that looked anything like a Dachau. So that was a little bit of an artistic license, which isn't necessarily important, but I don't want to lose the thread on this, since this is the Gay History Book Club. They were sent to Dachau, and Dachau was liberated April 29th. What I had hoped to be able to ask Dr. Newsome, but he had to sign off, was to talk a little bit about what ended up happening after the war. So the camps were liberated, but if you recall his earlier discussions, he talked about paragraph 175. Paragraph 175 had been on the books since 1871, and then had been rewritten in 1935. When the camps were liberated, the Allies that were liberating the camps basically looked at the intake records of the criminals that were, or all the people that were interred there, and recognized that in some cases there were criminals. There were stars that were for actual criminals. And technically, everyone wearing a pink triangle was in violation of paragraph 175. So in most, if not all cases, the men that were incarcerated for crimes from paragraph 175 were moved to traditional prisons. They were not liberated. They were told that they had to finish serving their sentence. What that plays into is, and there's been a couple of notes in the chat, which I hadn't shared because I wanted to save it for this portion of it. What that plays into is because they were then viewed to be criminals, when reparations started occurring for some of the other victims of the Nazi atrocities, the homosexual population was not deemed eligible for reparations. And so a couple of things happened after the war ended. So paragraph 175 was on the books. Everyone, dust off your memory banks of your high school history class. We then created West Germany and East Germany. And this is somewhat important and somewhat ironic as this plays itself out. So paragraph 175 is actually a law in the books. The Allies decided we're going to leave this to the people of East Germany and of West Germany to determine what they do with that law. One side decided, you know what, that 1935 revision is a little draconian. We're going to knock that off the books. We're going to have something, but it's going to go back to that lesser version of 1871. And Raj, would you like to tell everyone who was the one that decided to make that, keep the lesser law?
Surprisingly, it was East Germany.
Yes, you heard us right. East Germany were the nice guys because West Germany decided to keep the harsher law from 1935. And one of the statistics that Dr. Newsome shared in his presentation to Queensborough College was from 1949 until 1969, 100,000 men, primarily men, 100,000 men were arrested under that continuing law of paragraph 175. Raj, would you like to tell how many people were arrested by the Nazis under that law?
About 100,000.
So you've got just as many people arrested after the war ended as had been incarcerated during World War II by the Nazis. That was shocking to me. Hindsight's 2020 when you're dealing with history. Everyone can judge what ended up happening. In some cases, they were doing what they thought was the right thing to do. But a lot of times, a lot of thought doesn't get put into things. And that is what ended up happening. So as we kind of fast forward, as I mentioned, the measurement that Dr. Jake Newsome used was from 1949 to 1969. It's a nice 20-year period, so there's a nice statistic for that. But something happened in 1969, and that is when West Germany did start loosening up that law. And so they made one revision in 1969, which didn't change all of the wording, but it did put in the concept of consent. So it did allow that if they were consenting adults, but they made the definition of a consenting adult being 21. In 1973, they lowered that age of consent to 18. And in 1994, they finally repealed it completely, and which basically put the age of consent at 16, which is what it is for, at that time at least, is what it was for heterosexual couples. So it wasn't until 1994 when paragraph 175 was effectively stricken from the books in West Germany. The reason that is also important is because it was in 1994 that victims of the concentration camps were able to ask for reparations. 1994. Most of the people that were incarcerated, 65% had died in the camps to begin with. The rest of them had probably died of old age. So it was a great movement, but it was still a little bit troubling. And then it was in 2002, and there's, depending on how you're studying the history, it gets a little confusing. In 2002, Angela Merkel reversed all of the get all the convictions that happened between 1949 and 1969. So those got waived in 2002. And then in 2017, that was when the first restitution for people who were arrested during that period of time, where they were also given compensation. So sometimes 2017 is used as the first time concentration camp victims were given reparations, but actually that was for that 20-year period after World War II when West Germany was doing that. But of course, by that time, Germany had reunified. So this takes place a much longer period of time. Again, going back into the book, the end of the book, it gets, again, we have to remember it is a fictionalization, but the things that it represents were definitely true. But what's important for the Gay History Book Club is this concept that you actually have individuals that suffered like this, and in many cases suffered in silence because they weren't able to get reparations. It could have affected their employment. If you finally got out of prison and you were there because you were gay, you really couldn't tell anyone what had happened to you because it was still technically a crime, even in West Germany. So those are the types of things that I wanted to make sure we brought this out. And so I appreciate everyone joining. I wanted to keep this under 45 minutes in case we had questions. I do want to go backwards a little bit because there were a couple of individual comments that did talk about the time. So yes, so the law was not repealed until 1994, but it was changed several times. So I appreciate Tiger, you putting that, because you are absolutely correct. And the idea of and I think, Trojan for You had also said the same thing. It wasn't removed until 1969. So a lot of things did happen. A lot of changes were made, but it was slow moving. And we can't really forget that progress gets made. And that's why the Gay History Book Club has kind of come into fruition. I want to capture some of this stuff, educate people that I didn't know all these things had happened, certainly not to this level of detail. And because there was a movie version, I felt that this was probably maybe a little bit more of a accessible concept to start covering. So thanks everyone for joining us. Really appreciated the comments that were made. And I will be editing this video to be put out on my channel, tighten it up a little bit, and hopefully more people will be able to watch it and learn what we're trying to learn here in the Gay History Book Club. So thanks, Rod, for joining me. An absentee thank you to Jake for giving us his time earlier in the chat. And thanks to all of you for joining in the live chat. So again, this is Patrick with Trusty Huckster Mercantile and Dr. Raj. And we'd like to thank you for your time. Thank you for putting your trust in Trusty Huckster. And we will talk to you again soon. Bye, everybody.